All right, so we're live. This is the node.js tracing work group meeting, Hangouts on Air, January 26, 2016, 2 p.m. So we have me, Patrick Mueller, Torsten Lorenz, Trevor Norris, Ben Ripkins, Thomas Watson. A bunch of people out today because there is a some kind of a Node Summit meeting talking about async errors or something like that that a lot of the usual attendees are at today. So I was going to kind of go through the agenda items, and then I kind of cherry picked some items from the meeting minutes of last meeting that we can talk about. So in the current agenda, and links to all this stuff are in the work item. Are in the issue. It's issue 38. Should be top of the list in the Tracing WG repo. So for the agenda, we have trace event is now in V8 4.9. So what that means, and this is from Ali had posted something to either a work item, I'm sorry, an issue. I guess it was probably in an issue, saying that they had just put some more of the trace event stuff into V849. He has a branch that you can play with some of the stuff, and he also outlined a little bit of the follow-on work that Google is going to be doing to kind of integrate that with Node, or precursors to that as part of integration into D8 that we can copy into Node. So I want to think a little bit about next steps there. It seems like they have some work they want to do, but maybe there's some stuff we can start doing in parallel. Start thinking about what this means to us. I also have need more meat, structure, and use case issues, and actually that melds right into what I was just talking about in terms of coming up with thinking about what we're going to be doing with trace events, and let's start getting some use cases together. The only other item on the agenda was async wrap info. I believe this is probably from Andreas, who's not here. So we can have Trevor provide any info on that if he can. For the just for the last minutes, looking at some of the stuff, I did issue a pull request for the slide for the work group and the foundation's getting involved slides. I don't think that's been merged, and there's no links or anything there. I'm not really kind of following that one too much. What else did we see here that was interesting? There was this outstanding issue. I think it came up last time with LTTNG tracing improvements. There's an issue in tracing WG. It's issue 34. Just talks about are there some other trace probes we can put in for LTTNG? I think this kind of also kind of folds into the next steps for the trace event stuff that we'll be hitting. So we'll just I don't have a personal interest on see this as sort of a kind of strategic thing, because I assume that part of looking at what we'll be doing with trace events is if there's some way we can tie the trace event new work that's going on or will be going on into things like LTTNG, so that we can expose some of those trace events through LTTNG as an alternative, as part of a build step or something like that, that something like that would be possible. And that also would cover, that sort of thing covers dtrace and the Windows metrics statistics thing. So I'm not like real hot on looking at that, other than if the any work goes on here, it would be interesting just as a sort of follow on for how it will affect all the other sort of tracing things going on. So let's talk about the trace event stuff. Trying to think, there is a tracking issue for it. It's issue 30, and I'm hoping if I look at it. Okay, so Ali did make a comment about the branch. I'm sorry, the fork he has of Node that has the base trace event stuff in it. Next question is, where did he write about a little more specifics? I'm thinking it was probably in issue 38. Yeah. So in the issue for today's meeting, 38, down near the bottom, Ali has quick update on trace events. So that's good, and I think that kind of sets the stage for thinking about kind of what I'm hoping that our friends at Google will be working on, and then what we can start thinking about above and beyond that. So the main things I guess I'm thinking about are the big issues are, what does one of these trace probe things look like? So I'd like to see an example of how you would emit a trace event with some interesting data in it, because I believe it allows you to put some interesting data in there. And then so that's it. So let me make a list here of things that are kind of obvious. What does emitting a trace event look like? The other thing is, how are we going to capture this? So presumably there's going to be some kind of a circular buffer that we will be able to pull events from. And I guess what's not clear to me is how do we expose that? So is that going to be some kind of JavaScript API, or is it a command line option, or that you pass the pipe, or?
No, it's all, as far as I understand, it's all left implementation, mostly.
Right. So what's our implementation?
Well, it should be processed. I mean, it's going to collect stuff and throw it into a circular buffer, as far as I understand. The reason for that is performance.
Yes.
That way it has as little overhead as possible. And then we have another thread that actually processes all the data going through. Now, I'm on the fence on whether we want to provide a default for that, or whether we just want to put the macros in there so implementers can't hook into it themselves.
I'm switching to headphones really quick. Hopefully it doesn't lock up my machine. Yes. Okay, so great question. So the question I have is, how is event buffer exposed? And you're, part of that question, is it exposed? Or to who, right? To who is it exposed? So it could be exposed to people building a node binary through some kind of build option that they add some code or some way of getting access to it, or it's somehow available in user land, right?
Well, I mean, technically, we could provide the circular buffer implementation and have an interface for that, and then we wouldn't even have to build your own node. It would be accessible through a native add-on or a native module.
Right. Yeah. So what I'd like to do is kind of probably start sketching those stories out. What sort of seems like makes sense. It did sort of sound like that maybe we'd go ahead and we would sort of get the trace buffer from the Google guy, or that we could copy it, right? So
Yeah.
so I mean that's kind of that's the blurry line there of sort of what I kind of hoping the Google folks sort of provide or help out with versus stuff we need to come up. But just in general, that's probably a good meaty topic for a separate issue.
I mean,
Just how is it exposed?
If I understand this correctly, I mean, what they want us to do is just implement trace buffer, trace config, trace log as part of the tracing controller, right? So they're basically supplying us the API, how this works, if I understand this correctly. And I think what Trevor is saying, that we build something on top of it that we can expose so add-ons can hook into it. Is that correct, Trevor, pretty much?
Mostly, yeah, but the API is more extensive than that. I mean, they even have asynchronous API to track asynchronous handles over time and stuff like that. So, what am I trying to say? There are a lot of different hooks we can put in, and so I think that the biggest discussion will be what do we put in and where, because since this has so little overhead, because that's by design, we can put a lot of them in without incurring, any overhead, and then have it in the default build, and then, yeah, maybe have a flag or something that determines whether those are written to the buffer or not.
Yeah, I would really like to see something like this. So I'm now from monitoring background coming here, and what I see is some folks like the guys from NodeSource with the NSolid monitoring tool. They ship an own version of Node, which seems kind of invasive. It would be great to have lots of these little pieces of information that most of these folks provide in Node, so that you can basically reference, like, okay, the piece of information that we're showing here, this is just the stuff that you can get from Node, and we're just showing it for you for convenience, or we're using it to process it and give you specialized information about how your application is behaving.
Though you need to understand that it can't give you all the same information, because this, again, by design, works asynchronously, right? And so you couldn't say, give me a list of all the active handles at this exact moment in time.
Yeah, sure. But stuff, I think I opened an issue about this. Stuff like, when does a garbage collection occur? Or what is the event loop lag that some of these tools have, or something like this.
Mm.
What I always hate to see is you open up a monitoring tool, there are various ones, and you always have to figure out, like, how do they get this information? And is it the same one that you see in monitoring A, or does it differ to the value that you see in monitoring tool B, and how do they get this?
Yeah.
Having a standardized way to get this information, I think, would clear up a lot of confusion about stuff that you see in these monitoring tools and would help you interpret this information. So,
yeah, I mean, I certainly, that's kind of part of what I'm looking for here is that it will be, this stuff will be hopefully a little bit more visible than it is today. I mean, you can do some of this low-level tracing stuff today. Torsten has all kinds of crazy demos he can show you of playing with very low-level trace stuff. But part of what I would like to see happen here is that it does get exposed, and the question is, where do we expose? And Trevor's probably on the right track, that we kind of start start at the kind of low-level thing and maybe provide something that somebody could build a native module to be able to access this stuff. And then over time, if this stuff looks like it would actually be a good fit in core, for instance, then that can be sort of a follow-on step. But starting at least at that level would allow anybody to be able to play with the tracing at userland, but a little bit harder than JavaScript. There'll be some C++. But that's no different than the profiling and heap snapshot capabilities, and those are available for end users through native packages as well.
Yeah, one issue is the idea of exposing it via a JavaScript API. This was designed to be very little, if any, overhead, asynchronous, processed off thread. And so the thought of bringing all that data back into the main thread just to emit it on a JavaScript API seems counterproductive and against the very design that this has.
Yeah, let me I guess clarify a little bit. I'm actually not expecting anybody to be reading live trace events from their own node program. I think you're absolutely correct there that it's going to be overwhelming, presumably, right? If we end up adding a lot of these probes, and there's a lot of events, trying to sort of read what your program is doing itself tends to become sort of problematic. So I sort of expect that the trace events are going to get put somewhere. Where they get put, you could imagine a file, you could imagine a socket, that kind of thing. But I also think there's perhaps room to expose APIs, and let's just say it'll be through a third-party native package that's accessing some new Node C++ APIs to do things like start and stop tracing and reconfigure it. So, like, my understanding of the way the tracing works is you have to sort of tell it what you're interested in, and then it will kind of reconfigure the tracing stuff live in a very performant way. So you can sort of pick what you want to be able to trace, and then start tracing. If you want to change what you're tracing, then you would have to stop it and then reconfigure it and start it again. So I would expect, like, this imaginary V8 tracing third-party native module might end up having some APIs like configure trace, start trace, stop trace, maybe even like point trace data at and give it a file or a socket or something like that. So I'm not expecting people to sort of usefully or practically be able to eat their own tracing information. That just doesn't seem like that makes a whole lot of sense to me.
Yeah, the idea, one of the fundamentals of the API is that everything has categories. And so just exactly like we do today with our debug function in core, where everything's labeled and then you can specify, I want only HTTP calls. The same thing with the tracing API. You can specify a category or a set of categories that you want it to report on.
Right. And so this notion of, well, what categories are we going to have for Node, right? So presumably there will be some for V8, like compilation, garbage collection, that kind of stuff. And presumably we'll want some in Node as well that are Node specific. So that's sort of part of the question of, well, that's one of the questions. I guess it's sort of independent of, like what does a trace event look like and that kind of stuff. It's more like, well, what exactly do we plan on tracing? And maybe we actually do need to know. Maybe we do need to have some examples so we can sort of wrap our heads around um, what kind of things we can actually spit out to start thinking about, well, where would we actually use those in Node? Now,
Well, actually, as far as I understand, the whole event format is very, very simple. All that really is required is that you have a timestamp, right? So it's like this line delimited JSON like of events, and each one has a timestamp, and then you can put whatever else you want in there, and then basically just the tool that you use to consume that has to kind of know how to handle it. And as far as I understand, the category is also included with that event. The question is, so like what you were saying is almost like we could at runtime kind of emit events we want, but as far as I understand, and Trevor, correct me if I'm wrong, we'd still have to already add the hooks everywhere. We'd have to basically in C++ code we already have to emit certain events, and then that has to be kind of built in, and then we can ignore them or not depending on the category.
exactly. Yeah, that's my understanding as well.
Now, also understand, like some of these tracing events have up to 7 fields that need to be filled out, the async ones specifically. And the data delivered, as far as I understand from Ali, is just raw bits that need to be parsed out. That's why it's handed off to another thread to be, turned into strings and whatever that can actually be read by someone.
Right. So there's constraints, presumably, on the data that we give them. It has to, survive for a certain amount of time, right? Until somebody pulls it out and formats it, because it's going to get, written somewhere, and then later somebody's going to be poking through it. So you can't just give it some sort of a JavaScript thing that would end up getting garbage collected or moved, doesn't matter which, because it won't be there. So that's going to be one of the interesting constraints in terms of what are the constraints on the data that we can provide, and how are we going to easily be able to manage that if we do want to put some sort of dynamic data in there.
So Trevor, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just wondering. So basically, these fields that you have to add to these async events, those are there because the tool that is going to visualize this wants these fields, right? As far as I understood, you could also have like custom events, and if you have a tool that knows how to consume it, you can emit whatever you want. Am I wrong in that? Or that's what my initial understanding was, anyways. That all you need is a timestamp, and anything else. Fine.
Well, there's a call like trace event with timestamp. There are tons of different calls, right? And that's just one of them. But what I'm saying is, what you get out is just like all the bits all the bits lined up. So it's like category group is a set of bits, and then the timestamp is a set of bits. So that needs to be parsed out.
Right. Oh, so you're talking about the low level, actually, the binary format of these events.
Exactly.
Okay. Makes sense.
Ali, or maybe even Nat from way back, did talk about some kind of standardized tools to print this stuff, and they were extendable. I can't remember. I'd have to go back and listen to the meetings. I doubt any of that stuff got written down. It also seemed like it was, not necessarily a given that would happen. But that was maybe a hopeful thing. I guess I'm less kind of worried about pulling the stuff out right now, because I assume Google has some pretty good stories around being able to consume these trace events from wherever they're being put and do something interesting with them that we can either reuse or clone. I think the the harder bits are going to be, what are we actually going to be doing in Node itself. There was another kind of issue about whether or not we should allow people to emit events from within JavaScript. And I think we may have a problem there in terms of a couple things. Like, is it possible to create these categories dynamically as
No,
well?
they're just all macros. The entire thing is a set of macros.
Yeah, that's what I thought. The sort of fallback is, well, you could always create a user 1, user 2, sort of category, and then allocate them to people who need them. But then you still have a question of, well, what kind of data are they going to be able to put on there, right?
I mean, on a high
that's
level.
Go ahead.
I was going to say on a high level, you can emit. I mean, so we were talking about. I think we were talking about maybe two different things. Like one is like the low-level implementation, the binary these things, but then what actually gets transmitted then to the Chrome data tools, for instance. In this case, it's still called Chrome tracing. That format, like, it's just JSON, and you can emit these events also from JavaScript. It doesn't matter how you get them, and you just feed them to the Chrome tracing. You can read them. That's what Trace Viewerify, for instance, does. And then it will be able, by the timestamps, basically to align them. So you could have events coming from C++ with the async API, or with that API they give us, and then you could still emit additional events from the JavaScript layer and make sure the timestamps are in sync, and then you can put that data together, and you can still then read that as one thing. But that's more like on looking at the high level, at actually consuming and like the data, the actual JSON data.
Right, but imagine you had some sort of a high-level package that read files, and you wanted to emit a trace event every time you processed a file. You just began and started, right? What kind of data are you going to? Where would you have to put like the file name? Would you have to create a buffer for it, and then arrange for that thing to not get garbage collected until after the trace event is actually converted to JSON? You know what I'm saying? It seems like a very tough problem to me, unless I kind of know more about the categories and the expectation of the lifetime of the pointers, presumably in that are in some of these trace events. It's not clear to me that there's going to be an easy JavaScript userland story to emit events. I think that's fine. We don't need to tackle that one immediately, but it would certainly be fun to kind of have that kind of capability, I think. All right, I kind of have I think that was kind of my brain dump of trace events, and I think what I need to do is go back through the existing issues, and there's the one that I mentioned that has 30. It's trace event tracking. I think that one's good just to kind of keep the status of the work that is going on at Google. The tracing use cases, though, I'm feeling like maybe that kind of needs to be broken out into things like, how are we going to expose the trace events if we're going to do something different than what Google provides? APIs to start and stop tracing, and where are we going to put tracing? Those seem like kind of meaty enough topics that we could start noodling on separately. And this is all sort of precursor to get us, so we have a little bit of momentum and kind of have some thoughts about where we want to go once this tracing stuff kind of lands. Does anybody have any other any thoughts on that, or any other thoughts on the trace event stuff before we move on?
Well, you were mentioning the fork that Ali has, where he's working on I guess the D8 stuff. I can't find the link to that fork. Do you know where that is?
Yeah, it is in. I can post a link. Hold on. It's in the. I think it was 30. Yeah, there it is. It's in
And
issue. It's in issue 30. So I just pasted it into the chat there. Tracing WG issues 30. There's not much there. Actually, go and look at what we should probably do is cut and paste what he put in near the bottom of issue 38, which I just pasted in with the quick update, which actually describes a little bit of what's going on there. Because the fork wasn't much to go on. I took or at least not for me. I took a brief look at it, but I quickly got lost. Anyone else? We move on to async wrap. All right. So, Andreas, thanks for joining. I was hoping you would make it. And I believe you had added some agenda items for async wrap. So would you like to take the floor?
Yes, I will try. I haven't spoken all day, so I'm a bit rusty. Alright, so the first item is about getting native add-ons integrated with async wrap. So there was some work on that, but there's a lot of concerns whether or not we really want to expose this async wrap class that would enable add-ons to integrate with async wrap. So really, what is the status here? Do we want this class? If not, what are the alternatives?
No, it's not even so much the async wrap class, it's the one it inherits from, which is the base object class, which is fundamental to pretty much everything. And exposing that, you expose a lot of internals, because it's all tied to the environment class, which is internal only, which means that it's impossible to create a class that doesn't expose internal methods that could crash your application if you tried to run them, even though technically you could compile your application. It's just deeply integrated, and so there's no. After working on it for a while and talking with Ben, I just wasn't able to find a way to separate those things, because it was never written with public API in mind. Maybe possible to create a user class that doesn't inherit but has stores an async wrap class on it. Okay, maybe I can try that. Okay, and I'm going to try something else with it. But yeah, exposing async wrap, I'm totally fine with.
Okay, that sounds good. I mean, I just want to know there's some movement there. It's outside my experience range, so.
Yeah, I'm just. The only problem has been every path I've taken has led to a brick wall. That's been the only holdup thus far.
All right. Then the next item is a follow-up on the HTTP and making callbacks. Have them. I don't know. There was some changes to them. That was necessary.
That is a freaking nightmare. So I've managed to make callback mostly. Well, I've managed to make it completely reentrant. The problem, though, is that if you have an error handler set up and you run a callback through make callback, execution of the script itself, so with domains, if you do domain.run and the function within run grows, execution of the script halts. And that's by design. Now, if you run a function within a make callback, it runs synchronously, and that function will halt execution, but then the very next line outside of that function will execute, and the remainder of the script will execute normally. And the only way I found around that right now is to get rid of the try catches in make callback. But I've been unable to determine whether that would mess with existing debugger tools. Actually, Torsten, you could help me with this. I need to run some smoke tests against different debuggers to see if removing try catch would cause an issue with those. Because we could remove them, but then it would be a major change. But we want to be able to backport these changes to v4. Torsten, you alive?
I'm alive, yeah. I could have a look. I'm not fully sure that I fully understand what we need to do here. But if you point me at some stuff to read and look at.
Well, like, I know you know how to use a bunch of different JavaScript debuggers. So I'll just give you a fork, and you just run it against the debuggers and see if anything weird happens. That's basically all I'm trying to do.
Okay.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah, as soon as that goes in, then the Fudor's patch can land.
I think we can move on to whatever the next item is.
All right. Well, cool. I don't think there are any. At least I didn't have anything else. We've sort of been focusing on trace event and async wrap, and for most of these calls, and this one is no different. Because Ali and Matthew from Google Node V8 land were not able to make it. I was assuming we probably want to have a meeting maybe earlier than we otherwise would have to to kind of have them catch us up with the trace event stuff. But I'm actually kind of wondering if we at least get started on some of these higher level issues. I'm not sure there's anything really necessarily blocking us, or things that we can't have them at least help out with in sort of an async manner, in terms of providing an example in the lifetime expectations of data that's being put into trace events and whatnot, for these other kind of high level things that we need to start looking at. So unless somebody really wants to, I guess I would opt to just plan on having a meeting next month, and hopefully we can get a little more detail on the trace event stuff. It also gives them a little bit more time to see how they're doing in terms of folding it into Node. Any thoughts? No thoughts, so I'll take that as a meeting next month, and I will try to actually do something useful in this space in terms of trying to get some new issues created for us to have as discussion about some of these higher level things. So next meeting in a month, and I'll get on track to start doing Doodle and whatnot for that. Anything else anybody want to talk about while we're here?
Can I just ask one question to you, Trevor? Maybe you've covered it previously, but is the async wrap, is that planned to be backward compatible with LTE?
Yeah, well, we've had a discussion about that, and it's been decided that since it's still internal, but we want it to be public-facing, that we would backport all the changes from now to V4 so that when we release the documentation for it, people who try and use it on V4 aren't broken.
Okay, that sounds really great. I look forward to that.
Cool.
Cool. Well, I guess that's it for today, unless anybody has anything else last minute. I'll talk to everybody in about a month, and hopefully we'll have a few more people, a few more of the regulars here. Bye-bye.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
See you. Bye-bye.